Good to go. Thank you. We're going to get started. Looking to see if there are any new people here in the room. I'm Lisa Ridge, the president of New Jersey Humanist Network. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We've got Joe Vincenzino doing the tech work to make this hybrid event possible and handling Zoom duties to keep the focus on our speaker and his presentation. Yes, I am not Nick Fish. But I am using Nick's laptop to do these announcements and his introduction. So NJHN is a community for secular humanists. We're celebrating our 30th year this year. We offer programs and activities that promote humanism and secularism, provide community support for celebrations and challenges of life, and create opportunities for our members to act on their humanist values. We embrace reason, ethics, social justice, and philosophical naturalism, and we're committed to the understanding of the universe and solving problems through our compassion, our common experience, and civic engagement. And we're interested in cooperative efforts with other organizations on the issues where we find common ground. I want to tell you about some of our upcoming events because there's a lot of activity coming up. Our Exploring Humanism discussion on global awareness will be on next Sunday, November 3rd. That's on Zoom. Then our next program meeting will be November 17th with Kate Cohen, who's the author of the recent book, We of Little Faith, Why I Stopped Pretending to Believe, and Maybe You Should Too. Kate will speak in person at the Franklin Township Public Library. Our monthly dinner then will be on November 19th at the Omega Diner in North Brunswick. And then looking ahead in December, we'll have our last Exploring Humanism discussion of this year on responsibility on December 1st. Then our Human Light celebration will be on Sunday, December 15th at the Stony Brook Grill in Branchburg. We'll soon be announcing the details of that celebration, along with our, what we usually do, a holiday card exchange, the silent auction, a food pantry collection, and our celebrating at that event, our 30th anniversary milestone. And finally, our last book club of this year will meet on December 26th. And we'll be discussing braiding sweetgrass, indigenous wisdom, scientific knowledge, and the teachings of plants by Robin Wall Kimmerer. Details on all of this are on our website or soon will be at njhn.org. Very soon, we'll be asking for signups for our holiday card exchange and for help with donated items for the online silent auction. Finally, we're holding a membership drive at the end of the year. So if you've been meaning to become a dues-supporting member of NJHN, now would be a great time. Everything that we are able to do for our humanist community is only possible with our members' financial support, and we are grateful to all our members. We will have time for Q&A after the talk, and those of you on Zoom can ask questions directly or type them into the chat at that time. So I'll introduce today's speaker. Nick Fish is a seasoned civil rights and civil liberties activist with 15 years of political organizing and leadership experience with many of the nation's most prominent political organizations and progressive nonprofits, defending the separation of religion and government, advocating for equality under the law, and protecting civil rights for all Americans. A native of Michigan, Nick studied political science at Albion College before working in Raleigh, North Carolina, managing a voter outreach office that registered more than 5,000 new voters and knocked on 25,000 doors in the 2 months leading up to the 2008 election. After the election, Nick worked in donor outreach marketing, fundraising, and communications, including with the Secular Coalition for America. Nick first joined American Atheists in 2012. He served as the Development Director and the National Program Director before his appointment as President of American Atheists in September of 2018. He has represented American Atheists in the media, including appearances on Fox News programs and many other media outlets. He's been quoted in various national news outlets. He has created innovative advocacy and visibility campaigns and has developed messaging and strategy around American Atheists' legal, public policy, and outreach campaigns. Nick also has the distinction of being our last program speaker before we stopped programs due to the pandemic in 2020. So after 4 years and 7 months, please join me in welcoming back Nick Fish.
Sit up here.
You'll turn off the people.
Yeah. Thanks, Lisa. I wanted to just, I had forgotten that I was the last person to speak to NJHN before COVID. I hope I'm not to blame in any way for all of that. So we'll go ahead and get things started here. I'm going to share my screen and just make sure all the settings are correct here. So just give me one moment if you would bear with me, please. Okay, that seems to be working. And then I just make sure that all the Zoom is correct. Okay. All right. I think that's working. Everybody good on your side over there? Okay. You can see me, hear me. Very good. All right. So I just wanted to start by thanking everyone for your hospitality. It's always a pleasure to be here at the New Jersey Humanist Network. As Lisa said, this is not my first time here. Hopefully it won't be another 4 years with a pandemic intervening before the next time I'm able to be here. Although, as Lisa said, this is the last program before the election. So who knows? There may be something else that gets in the way. I'm hopeful not. I wanted to start just by talking a little bit about kind of some stuff that happened already this year. Some of you may have been there. Earlier this year, American Atheists hosted our annual conference in Philadelphia, where I now live after spending almost 10 years living here in New Jersey. Our conference brought together hundreds of atheists, humanists, and non-religious people from all over the country and indeed all over the world, giving them an opportunity to connect with people at a human level. It was a chance for us to learn about the great work that our community is doing at the local level, but also learn about how we're confronting the profound effects and the profound threats facing our democracy. I think you're all certainly acutely aware of those threats, even here in New Jersey. This is not some walled off, isolated, pure place where no bad stuff ever happens. You aren't immune to the threats that happen in the federal level just because you happen to be in a state that takes seriously protecting folks' civil rights and civil liberties. And having our conference in Philadelphia, arguably the birthplace of American democracy, certainly elevated a lot of these issues in our consciousness. So I'll tell you a story. Back in 1787, delegates from 12 states, Rhode Island decided not to attend, arrived in Philadelphia, just like we did, and just a few blocks actually from where we held our national convention. And they were there to discuss potential changes to the Articles of Confederation. And the delegates didn't come to draft an entirely new constitution. They didn't think that was necessary, but it eventually became crystal clear that simple revision of the Articles of Confederation wouldn't suffice. What they needed to do was create a whole new system of government. And from May to September of that year, that's exactly what they did. And on September 17th, the final day of the Constitutional Convention, delegates signed the final proposed version of what would eventually become our Constitution. As the delegates were leaving the convention that day, and the final version was being prepared for distribution through the papers, a woman by the name of Elizabeth Willing Powell, who was a paragon of Philadelphia society and sort of a behind-the-scenes player in Philadelphia politics, asked Benjamin Franklin, "Well, Mr. Franklin," she asked, "what have we got? A republic or a monarchy?" And what he responded was, a republic, if you can keep it. And so what we're gathered together here today, and what we were there in Philadelphia earlier this year to do, and what we're voting on in 9 days, and indeed right this moment in the library where we're meeting, people are voting. Yesterday they said they had 1,200 people vote, is how we keep our republic. How do we, as a community of atheists and humanists, united in our shared values, act boldly and collaboratively to protect and rebuild our democracy? How do we ensure that that democracy is inclusive, forward-looking, adaptive, and centered around our shared human experience? I think it understands with starting to understand what we're up against and understanding what's at stake. We've spent the last 7 or 8 years in this community talking almost constantly, to the point that people are tired of it, I bet, about the threat of white Christian nationalism. But what is that? I think some of us still don't know what that is. Some folks might be new. At its most basic level, white Christian nationalism is a fusion of beliefs about what it means to be truly American. And in this vision of Americanness that they have, there are winners and losers. There are people who are chosen by God to rule, and those who are destined to be ruled. And I'm not telling you anything you don't know when I say that the white Christian nationalist movement seeks nothing less than total domination of our nation. These extremists, these so-called self-appointed guardians of their definition of religious liberty, believe that they are God's chosen ones, literally, that they alone have the authority, the mandate to rule over us. And they seek dominance over all aspects of American life: family, religion, education, the media, arts and entertainment, business, and government.
So it don't matter who tries to do what government tries to do what. I'm here to tell you, if the church arises in this hour, the church is about to take this country back. It's about to take the government back. It's about to take the schools back. We're about to take back Hollywood, arts and entertainment, education. I'm telling you, if the church will rise up, this is why God is calling the Esthers in this hour, in this moment, and he's created himself a movement for this time. Are you ready? Because we're not here to patty cake. We're here to take over. Hey, that's what the right wing watch and all these like to call me. There's a dominion guy. There's the guy that's trying to take everything over. I said, yes, I am, for the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. 2024, we're taking over in the name of Jesus. Because here's my point. If the church organizes, we win. If the church organizes, we win.
That was Mark Gonzalez, a pastor who is associated with the Dominionist New Apostolic Reformation, speaking at an event in Houston called Crowned 2024. It's important for us to acknowledge, obviously, that this sort of rhetoric, these beliefs, are not limited to an extreme few. And while it's true that these beliefs certainly don't represent the views of the majority of our fellow Americans, or even the views of a majority of American Christians, there are millions of Americans who hear this rhetoric in their churches every single Sunday. PRRI, the Public Religion Research Institute, estimates that approximately 10% of Americans are adherents to white Christian nationalism, and that another 19% are sympathetic to this ideology. But 29% reject it outright, and another 39% are skeptical. So when we talk about finding common ground with people who share our values, namely our commitment to a pluralistic, inclusive, secular democracy, we have to remember that we are the majority in this country. Our view that the separation of church and state is the best protection of all of our rights is not just the right position, it's the popular one. And the popularity of our position and its righteousness, unfortunately, no longer seem to matter in some states. And that's because our politics has become increasingly disconnected from policies. The fights today that are happening in Washington, D.C., and in state houses all over the country, including here in New Jersey, and at school boards and city council meetings, week after week, often have very little or nothing to do with tax rates, how we're going to address housing shortages or prices, or build new transit, or who has the best plan to extend health access to millions of Americans. Instead, the fights we're having are about book bans, criminalizing healthcare for our LGBTQ loved ones, especially our trans friends and family, attacking the right to make our own decisions about when or if to give birth, gutting our public education system. And increasingly, these are attacks on democracy itself. And given the interconnectedness of our nation, the nationalization of politics and media, the influence of major national political figures on local news and culture, and the ease of finding our tribe online using social media, the fact that the political and cultural fights of Washington have now filtered down into our communities, polarizing and in some cases even radicalizing our neighbors against us, it's probably not a surprise. But this threat isn't limited to our communities either. As I told my colleagues at the World Humanist Congress in Copenhagen last year, American Christian nationalist organizations and the extreme religious groups that fund them have found tremendous success in exporting their extreme religious beliefs and their bigotry into the political systems of other nations. It's an unfortunate fact that our failure in the United States to confront the rise of religious nationalism and its anti-democratic impulses means a rise in religious nationalism across the globe and democratic backsliding that puts all of our nations at risk. Before we dive in any further, I want to give a little bit more background about myself. I came into this work like many of us do after seeing my own rights taken away from me. In 2004, I was able to vote for the first time. And as someone who paid far more attention to politics than any normal 18-year-old probably should have, I was excited to be able to cast my first vote, have that opportunity for the first time. But for those who may not remember what was going on in the United States in 2004, let me dive in a little bit there. This was the re-election campaign of George W. Bush. The United States had just invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, and despite public opinion initially supporting both, President Bush's support was failing. And so in that election, his campaign needed a way to shore up support among their evangelical Christian base. They made the cynical decision that the best way to do that was to use the rights of LGBTQ people, such as myself, as a wedge issue to motivate voters to go to the polls. Using recent court decisions in Hawaii and Massachusetts, they painted the court-ordered expansion of marriage equality to same-sex couples as an existential threat to the sanctity of marriage and to the moral fabric of America. They talked about how marriage was a sacred institution, and the United States, with its sort of early movements toward secularization, was in danger of abandoning its so-called Christian heritage. They painted the extension of the institution of marriage to include gay and lesbian Americans as somehow cheapening heterosexual marriage. And perhaps most resonantly with the evangelical, extreme evangelicals and conservative Christians, they portrayed LGBTQ people themselves as a threat to children in 11 states where they were on the ballot. It was a time when what we might call popular democracy was used to take away the rights of a vulnerable minority. In fact, it was the primary message they used to reinforce the righteousness of their cause. Who are these unelected judges to tell us, the Christian majority, that we have to recognize and celebrate sin in this nation, they would ask. Those appeals to populism and the hostility to civil and human rights guardrails intended to protect the rights of a vulnerable minority from the whims of the majority still resonate today. But those targets of those appeals to populism are no longer judges. They've got that taken care of already, but so-called cultural elites, woke corporations, teachers, librarians, doctors, universities, the system itself, captured, they say, by an entrenched deep state hostile to the beliefs and preferences of so-called real Americans. The language of their calls to action is often framed today in explicitly religious terms, fights between good and evil. Every issue and policy fight, an end of times battle that must be waged by spiritual warriors.
And I want to use this opportunity to share religion and Christianity.
Okay. Got it. I think you can do like a switch. Might be a different view here, but yeah, if I have to share every time. Okay. All right, one more. Let's start that one again.
And I want to use this opportunity to share a piece of historical, theological information with you. It's a wonderful sermon I found in preparation of this talk by Samuel Davies. Samuel Davies was an early American Presbyterian minister, and he preached a sermon titled "The Curse of Cowardice" in 1758. This was during the French and Indian War, and Davies had moved back to Hanover, Virginia, and he was trying to rally the local militia to join in and fight with the British. At that time, they were still all British, against the French and against the Indians. And so this is an excerpt from the sermon he preached, so please listen because this is good. He says, "When in this corrupt, disordered state of things, where the lusts of men are perpetually embroiling the world with wars and fighting, and throwing all into confusion, when ambition and avarice would rob us of our property for which we have toiled, on which we subsist, when they would enslave the freeborn mind and compel us meanly to cringe to usurpation and arbitrary power, when they would tear from our eager grasp the most valuable blessing of heaven, I mean our religion, when they invade our country, formerly the region of tranquility, ravage our frontiers, butcher our fellow subjects, or confine them in barbarous captivity in the dens of savages, when our earthly all is ready to be seized by rapacious hands, and even our eternal all is in danger by the loss of our religion. When this is the case, what is then the will of God? Must peace then be maintained with our perfidious and cruel invaders, maintained at the expense of property, liberty, life, and everything dear and valuable, maintained when it is in our power to vindicate our right and do ourselves justice? Is the work of peace then our only business? No. In such a time, even the God of peace proclaims by his providence to arms." And if we have ever lived in a point in time in American history since then that we could argue that now is a time to arms again, I think we are getting close. And I want to use this opportunity.
So that was William Wolfe, a speaker who is, and a person who is deeply connected to the Christian nationalist movement. He's a former Trump administration official who also spent time with the Heritage Foundation's Heritage Action. He's called for ending sex education in schools, ending surrogacy, and ending no-fault divorce. He said that Christians, quote, should reject a Christless conservatism and demand the political movement we are most closely associated with make a return to Christ-centered foundations, because it's either Christ or chaos, even on the right. And Wolfe is closely tied to the folks pushing Project 2025, something that I know a lot of us know about, which was a $22 million plan backed by the Heritage Foundation and backed by some of the most extreme proponents of Christian nationalism. On that agenda, rolling back and undoing Obergefell and ending marriage equality, a categorical nationwide ban on abortion, limiting access to IVF and indeed contraception, banning pornography, and redefining anything they find offensive to be pornography to make it easier to ban. And we all recall Donald Trump's attempts to distance himself from Project 2025. I don't know anything about it. I don't know who's behind it. I don't know these people at all. But his claims that he wouldn't support an abortion ban. But earlier this year, Wolfe was speaking to The Sentinel, a far-right digital media outlet, and discussing Trump's stance on abortion. During that discussion, he said, quote, "I actually think there's wisdom in cloaking some of your power levels and maybe some of the things you're trying to do. And then once you secure power and you have it, you can govern in a more extreme way." So we've been talking about the threat, quote, posed by the white Christian nationalist ideology for years now. And the media and politicians are finally waking up and recognizing it. They're seeing that white Christian nationalists aren't just Christians who happen to be conservative or conservatives who happen to be Christian. Rather, it's a belief that one must adhere to not just Christianity, but to a particular form of conservative Christianity to be truly American. And that adherence to this brand of Christianity is the only way to truly be Christian. It's a Christianity that's highly structured, advocates for so-called traditional gender roles and hierarchies, and that is intolerant of dissent and internal critique. It's a Christianity that values the accumulation of power for the sake of holding power. I got you. Yep, I got you.
Religion and Christianity are the biggest things missing from this country. And I truly believe that we need to bring them back, and we have to bring them back fast. I think it's one of the biggest problems we have. That's why our country is going haywire. We've lost religion in our country. All Americans need a Bible in their home, and I have many. It's my favorite book. It's a lot of people's favorite book. This Bible is a reminder that the biggest thing we have to bring back America and to make America great again is our religion. Religion is so important. It's so missing, but it's going to come back, and it's going to come back strong, just like our country is going to come back strong. In the end, we do not answer to bureaucrats in Washington. We answer to God in heaven. Christians are under siege. We must protect content that is pro-God. We love God, and we have to protect anything that is pro-God. We must defend God in the public square and not allow the media or the left-wing groups to silence, censor, or discriminate against us. We have to bring Christianity back into our lives and back into what will be again a great nation. Our founding fathers did a tremendous thing when they built America on Judeo-Christian values. Now that foundation is under attack, perhaps as never before. What can we do? Stand up, speak out, and pray that God will bless America again. I'm proud to endorse and encourage you to get this Bible. We must make America pray again. Pray, get educated, get motivated, and stand with me and the legions of Americans asking God to bless our great nation, to bring our great nation back, and to make America great again.
You too can buy right now. It's also, we need a religion in this country. We have to defend religion. It's also a convenient way to pay your legal bills, $60 at a time. So just something to keep in mind. White Christian nationalism is an ideology that is hostile to any form of multiculturalism, multiracialism, multi-faith democracy, and pluralism. It holds that longstanding racial hierarchies must be preserved, that immigrants must assimilate to a particular form of Americanness without lending any of their own cultural context to our nation, that Black, Hispanic, and Asian Americans, especially if they are not evangelical Christians, are second-class citizens and can never be truly American. As scholars of white Christian nationalism, Samuel Perry and Philip Gorski wrote in their recent book, The Flag and the Cross, a distinguishing feature of the political expression of white Christian nationalism is what they refer to as the holy trinity of freedom, order, and violence. The freedom they're talking about is a kind of libertarian freedom, freedom for people like us being above all straight, white, Christian, native-born men. Maybe not those of us in this room. Order is what's to be imposed on everyone else, the people in this room, which means preserving racial and gender order and religious orders above all else. And violence is a righteous violence directed at anyone who would violate or threaten that order. This is a sort of political theology that uses Christian narratives and symbolism to great effect. And crucially, it's antithetical to our understanding of democracy and our values as humanists. Rather than attempting to convince voters that their positions are the right ones, Christian nationalism has its own version of the elect, meaning those who are chosen by God. I'm going to share one more video with you.
And so we're saying now that we essentially have globo-homo nationalism, what does it look like for us to sort of re-pour the foundations of a free society in America? God is not God of just your heart. God is God of the public square. And I would say that even if a judge or a dog catcher or a president is not a Christian, what they need to recognize most fundamentally is that all authority in God's creation is derivative from the Creator. And he tells everybody in authority how they should use it, whether they have repented of their sins and believed in Jesus Christ and accepted the gospel or not. They will be held accountable. And so our call as Christian nationalists is twofold. Yes, we want more unapologetic Christians leading in the public square as Christians, But we're calling on all leaders who exercise authority, whether they're Christian or not, to recognize that they will answer to the one supreme authority, and they need to learn how to exercise that authority rightly according to his good commands and precepts today.
I just love the chyron on this, by the way. Nations should submit to Christ. Like, that's a heck of a thing for a, news program to have up. So that was William Wolfe once again. And in his view and in the view of Christian nationalists, only the elect, those who believe they're accountable only to the supreme authority, not voters, not the people, should control the political power, lest people who are not like us gain access to that process. Those others, they believe, must be closely scrutinized, discouraged, and even denied access to the political process. Supporters of this ideology are fundamentally a threat to a pluralistic secular democracy. Survey after survey has found that they are less likely to say that we should make it easier for people to vote, far more likely to support racial and political gerrymandering, and they're far more likely to have supported attempts to overturn the election in 2020 through violence. And while this white Christian nationalist ideology is certainly ascendant in American politics and was dangerously close to victory in Arizona and Pennsylvania in 2022 and nationally in 2020, we cannot pretend that it's a recent development. To summarize sociologist Andrew Whitehead, Christian nationalism and anti-democratic attitudes have a long history in this country. After the Civil War in the 1860s and through the years of Jim Crow and into the Civil Rights era and beyond, white Christian leaders provided the theological justification to rationalize limiting Black Americans' access to participation in the democratic process. They explicitly tied their efforts to their desire to protect the purity of a Christian nation. They have not been and are not, they've never been and are not now simply policy disagreements. These are attempts to limit voting access, ranging from administrative barriers, making it harder to vote, to threats of violence used to disrupt the democratic process itself. These anti-democratic goals and actions are not hidden from public view or only whispered about in back rooms. In a 1980 speech to a group of evangelical leaders, Paul Weyrich, the co-founder of the Christian nationalist group Moral Majority, said this, quote, "Now many of our Christians have what I call the goo-goo syndrome, good government. They want everybody to vote. I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They have never been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections quite candidly goes up as the voting population goes down," end quote. For decades, Christian nationalists who are focused on gaining and maintaining power have been aware that a democracy with free and fair elections threatened the ability of white, culturally conservative Christians to maintain their privileged access to political power. Their response was obvious and consistent: make it more difficult or indeed impossible for the political opposition, inevitably racial, religious, and ethnic minorities, to vote. Weyrich and Jerry Falwell and their allies worked to create organizations to write and then enact policies and laws necessary to bring Christian nationalists' anti-democratic vision into being. Many of these groups still exist today, by the way, with just the thinnest veneer of respectability barely removed from their racist and theocratic origins, supporting restrictive voting rights and voting policies that disproportionately and intentionally affect people of color, including strict voter ID laws, automatic removal of voters from registration lists, and limiting the number of polling places, particularly in the urban cores of our cities. I see that very clearly in Philadelphia. Having successfully enacted many of the most restrictive gerrymandering laws and comprehensive voter suppression laws they could possibly imagine, the same organizations have now pivoted to a new strategy: demonizing LGBTQ people, criminalizing abortion, and undermining public education. They've done this through a plan that they themselves called Project Blitz. The stated goal of Project Blitz was to overwhelm state legislatures with bills based on centrally manufactured legislation and ginned up moral panics. One of the movement's founders, David Barton, said, "It's kind of like whack-a-mole for the other side. It'll drive them crazy that they have to divide their resources out in opposing this." And he was right. In just the past 5 years or so, we went from tracking 70 bills nationwide associated with Project Blitz to more than 1,400 last year. this year still going on. These bills often start small and symbolic, acknowledgements of the American national motto, "In God We Trust," putting them on as many flat surfaces as possible: school classrooms, city halls, courthouses, libraries, even police cars. From there, they build on those new laws and say, oh, see, we have a Christian heritage, to encourage state legislatures to declare a particular month Bible Heritage Month, the year of the Bible. What Bible, you might ask in that question? Well, that's not important. They sort of transition from this general promotion of religion as a cultural good to the specific promotion of Christianity, of particular forms of Christianity as inherently and uniquely American. But their ultimate goal, where these laws leave, is the policy-making world we're living in today, especially in states like Texas and Florida and Alabama and Arkansas. Their goals are to enact laws that put the lives of LGBTQ people at risk, period. One piece of legislation they pointed to as a model for future action was a 2016 Mississippi law that would have allowed private businesses and government employees to discriminate against LGBTQ people primarily, provided that they do so in accordance with sincerely held religious beliefs. The bill offered extraordinary protections, not to all religious beliefs, of course, but to a very narrow set of beliefs associated most with white Christian nationalist religion. And if you hold a different set of religious views, namely that a commitment to gender and LGBTQ equality or abortion access, there was no liberty in that bill or any of these bills for you. In another piece of state legislation, their goal was to have state legislatures resolve that, notwithstanding the Supreme Court's decision in Obergefell protecting same-sex marriage, that, quote, "This state supports and encourages marriage between one man and one woman, and the desirability that intimate sexual relations only take place in such couples." As we know, Christian nationalists are obsessed with what goes on in other people's bedrooms, but the sheer cruelty of their arguments and the disgust that they have for LGBTQ people is really laid bare here. The bill claimed that people in same-sex relationships have, quote, "a higher instance of serious diseases," end quote, and that gay sex costs taxpayers untold amounts of money, estimated to be in the billions of dollars annually, according to the bill template. So why have I focused so long on the historical successes and background of this anti-democratic, anti-humanist, and anti-pluralist movement in our nation? Well, because ultimately, the groups advancing this agenda are not satisfied with the progress they've made or the successes they've already won. Instead, they're looking at how to further roll back our rights and our progress even further, using tens and indeed hundreds of millions of dollars. They've already entrenched sympathetic judges on the federal bench, solidified a Christian nationalist majority on the Supreme Court for decades to come, and they've poured piles of money into astroturfed groups aimed at empowering groups in our backyards. They know that their ideology and their agenda are deeply unpopular and opposed by the overwhelming majority of Americans. They know that they're losing and that their time of privilege and wielding power is coming to an end. But if they can use that last bit of power to enact anti-democratic policies that insulate them from electoral accountability, they believe they can maintain power for just a little bit longer. And in that time, the most vulnerable of us will pay the price. ProPublica, the nonprofit news organization, recently released a story exposing the ideology that motivates Leonard Leo, the man behind the current and decades-long campaign to remake our nation's federal judiciary. From that piece, quote, "Having reshaped the courts, Leo now has grander ambitions. Today, he sees a nation plagued with ills: wokeism in education, one-sided journalism, and ideas like environmental, social, and governance, or ESG policies, sweeping corporate America. A member of the Roman Catholic Church, he intends to wage a broader cultural war against a progressive Ku Klux Klan and, quote, vile and immoral current-day barbarians, secularists, and bigots, who demonize people of faith and move society further from its, quote unquote, natural order." And Leo has a $1.6 billion war chest to enact his plans, provided by a 90-year-old manufacturing magnate turned donor, whose gift is believed to be the single largest political donation in history. Leo has used that money to strengthen ties between the Christian nationalist movement and so-called mainstream conservative organizations, donating tens of millions of dollars to groups like the Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society. What's more, Leo and his supporters are now explicitly advocating for publicly funded Catholic schools in Oklahoma to start, teeing up a case at the Supreme Court that threatens to destroy one of our nation's most important innovations, a secular public education that's accessible to all. Last year, Moms for Liberty, the so-called parents' rights group, held their annual conference in Philadelphia, just down the street from where we had ours this year. They endorsed hundreds of candidates for school board races, city councils, and state legislatures. About half of their preferred candidates won. And in those school districts, towns, and states, they got to work. Despite protestations that they weren't banning books or threatening LGBTQ teachers who happened to just mention that they have a spouse, they did exactly that. A report released earlier this year by PEN America found that Pennsylvania, along with North Dakota, South Carolina, and Florida, were the primary targets of book bans at the school district level. They removed books by Toni Morrison and Kurt Vonnegut, and even a poem written by Amanda Gorman that was read at Joe Biden's inaugural in 2021. In Alabama, they flagged a book called Read Me a Story, Stella, about a girl teaching her younger brother to read, as potentially explicit, because the author's last name was gay. According to the Miami Herald, in the more than 150 school districts that banned a book in 2022-2023 school year, the vast majority, 80%, had a chapter or local affiliate nearby of one of three groups that have been instrumental in these book bans: Moms for Liberty, Citizens Demanding Freedom, what a name, and Parents' Rights in Education. They passed sweeping and intentionally vague laws intended to chill speech and criminalize conduct that they view as immoral. They declared drag of any sort as inherently obscene, including if I was just standing here wearing something that would have been sold as women's clothes, that could be a drag show and would have been declared obscene. These laws are often so broad that they would classify a trans person even giving a talk on stage as a drag show, putting trans people at risk for criminal prosecution simply for speaking out on issues of public concern. They've sought to weaponize the power of government against people who believe that LGBT people have no place in society. And in typical authoritarian fashion, they engage in the biggest show of projection imaginable, claiming to be the real victims of that persecution.
Do you know how political opponents to those in power are dealt with in third world dictatorships, banana republics, and communist regimes? Well, it's simple. The people in power use their police agencies to arrest their opponents for made-up crimes in an attempt to discredit them, bankrupt them, imprison them, exile them, or all of the above. And if you're not paying attention, you may not realize that Joe Biden is using exactly those tactics to make sure that Donald Trump is not his opponent in 2024. Here's the problem. If these tactics end up working to keep Trump from winning or even running in 2024, it is going to be the last American election that will be decided by ballots rather than bullets.
Ballots rather than bullets. That, if you don't know, is former Governor Mike Huckabee, now television personality, I suppose, talking about, the crimes that Donald Trump committed and was being prosecuted for. This is obviously before President Biden stepped aside from the race and Vice President Harris started running. Just listening to that is outrageous. And I think it speaks to just this profound amount of projection and disconnect from reality that they have. Our opponents, though, know the power of these ostensibly local groups like Moms for Liberty. They understand that the illusion of popular support is key to their success. These are astroturfed groups that are funded by billionaires, and they can launder that slush fund that Leonard Leo has through this network to give the appearance of a popular backlash. But it's nothing of the sort. An analysis by the Washington Post found that 11 people, 11, were responsible for 60% of book bans nationwide in 2023. So what's the answer to this assault on our democracy, on our public schools, on our LGBTQ friends and loved ones, on abortion access, and on, again, democracy itself? How can we possibly fight back against a network that has $1 billion at its back, a group of obsessive extremists, and the support of many churches and religious leaders dotted all across the country? Well, the answer is right here in front of us today. And it's what we at American Atheists are committed to supporting at the grassroots as part of our strategic plan over the coming years. I'm sorry to say, unfortunately, that American Atheists and the broader non-religious community and our civil rights allies don't have any eccentric billionaires who have donated a $1.6 billion company to us to help us remake America in our own vision. We simply don't, unless you know someone, in which case I'll have a card for you. We can talk. But we do have a resource that Leonard Leo and his ilk don't. We have actual real people all across this country, a majority of Americans who agree with us, that recognize the threat of religious demagoguery. We have thriving, vibrant, and diverse communities and allies and partners who are standing against extremism and building bridges with other people of conscience who share those values. By unapologetically living our values out loud in our hometowns every single day, we're showing that the scaremongering and bigotry of white Christian nationalists simply doesn't hold water. We're showing our neighbors that claims by religious leaders that secularization will lead us to the downfall of society could be just a touch overstated. We're demonstrating that an inclusive, pluralistic vision of American values is the only way for a nation with almost 350 million people to survive and thrive. And we're finding allies and partners who share that vision and our values. This past November, last election, Karen Smith, an incumbent member of the Central Bucks School District Board of Education, won re-election to her seat and then was selected as the new school board president. At her swearing in, she chose to take her oath of office not on a Bible, but on a stack of banned and challenged books. She said, "I'm not particularly religious. The Bible doesn't hold significant meaning for me. And given everything that occurred in the last couple of years, the banned books, they do mean something to me at this point." And I suppose I should end or close on maybe a hopeful note, and if not hopeful, maybe aspirational and purposeful. It's our obligation as non-religious people, as humanists, as atheists, as community leaders, and as Americans committed to democracy, to properly frame the existential threat posed by white Christian nationalism. Their belief in the supremacy of religion over non-religion and of one particular religion over all others strikes at the very heart of our foundational beliefs in our community, as well as universal human rights. The struggle is not atheists and humanists against Christians, or progressives against conservatives, or white against black, or gay against straight. It's a struggle between this exclusive, exclusionary, divisive, dangerous ideology against all who would question it. It's incumbent upon us to speak out forcefully against the cruel and dehumanizing rhetoric and policies of the Christian nationalist movement, to build bridges to people who share our vision for a pluralistic society where all people have the freedom to believe or not believe as they see fit, to fight physically, gotta stand up maybe, lock arms, engage in civil disobedience, to protect the safety and human dignity of all people, but especially LGBTQ people, people who need access to abortion care, immigrants, and others. And it's vital that we push back against our fellow atheists and humanists who are out of step with those values and seemingly content to carry water for Christian nationalist extremists on a range of issues. And that work can only be done by a genuinely people-powered, grassroots-led movement. The profound threats to our democracy and broader examples of democratic backsliding we see globally are enabled by the campaign of dehumanization being waged against disfavored minority groups. After all, it's far easier for Christian nationalists and their enablers to justify extreme actions when they believe that their children are under attack or that their core being is under threat. To be crystal clear, their agenda does not end with mere obstacles to voting or book bans or restrictions on drag shows. Violence against disfavored groups is on their agenda, and it's already happening. Government officials in states are demanding lists of patients who have received medical care related to gender transition or abortion. Parents in Texas are being threatened with the removal of their children. The Attorney General of Texas was demanding that PFLAG chapters turn over their membership records to the state. We've seen mass shootings motivated explicitly by white Christian nationalism target Jews at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pennsylvania. Black Christian shoppers in Charlottesville, Black shoppers in Buffalo, New York. We've seen religious and ethno-nationalism used as a justification for shootings, not just in the United States, but also in Norway and New Zealand. The violence and the rhetoric that enables it must be forcefully condemned. Groups within our community with the resources to engage in advocacy must act now with the resources to push back and support grassroots advocacy and community building, promoting engagement in civic culture, whether that's voting, door knocking, registering voters, attending meetings, growing our community, and work to strengthen the guardrails that protect universal human rights and promote pluralism and mutual respect. Abroad, opportunists see the appeal of ethno-nationalist rhetoric and policies as potent political tools. The parallels between the white Christian nationalist movement to those in Hungary and even France, or the Hinduva movement in India, are hard to ignore. We can work to build coalitions with other faith and belief groups, collaborate where we find common ground, and ensure that we're communicating about these threats strategically and in a way that promotes genuine understanding rather than alienates potential allies. We have to be thoughtful and compassionate in our criticisms and our rhetoric, and not play into or allow ourselves to be used as tools of xenophobes, reactionaries, or bigots. And while it's true that the courts have long been a tool for us to vindicate our rights and protect the most vulnerable, even here in New Jersey or in my home state of Pennsylvania, we can no longer rely on them as good faith arbiters of the law or protectors of human rights and human dignity. They have been taken over and packed by this very same ideologues we are now forced to confront. Instead, we have to commit ourselves to making our arguments in the court of public opinion, getting our hands dirty in the political process, showing that the harms that come from the privileging of any one religion over all others, or from allowing the powers of the state to be wielded against dissenters, are real. But we also must do so without appealing to the base political populist instincts of division and blame that too many politicians turn to. There are more than 95,000 school board members elected all across this country, 7,000 state legislators, and almost 500,000 total elected office holders. Running for office, engaging in the difficult work of the political process, expanding access to voting, and supporting candidates who share our values, demonstrate our commitment to democracy and put us in stark contrast with our opponents. Any one of the people in this room or listening online could be the next Karen Smith, or could be the person who runs her campaign, or the person who convinces her to run in the first place, or the deciding vote in the election. I don't want to pretend that this is some easy path for us to follow. There is no cosmic force bending the moral arc of the universe toward justice. Instead, that slow, steady march of progress only continues because advocates like us and communities like ours unapologetically insist that our atheist, our humanist values, our commitment to bold, people-centered, inclusive democracies are the best way to protect the rights of all. Thank you. You're welcome.
And I know, so we're gonna have questions here. We can have questions in the Zoom chat. Depending on how well they can hear, we might have to.
I'll repeat any questions that folks have, yeah. So does anyone have any questions? Happy to. Sir.
You mentioned forming coalitions.
Yep.
Right now, it seems to me that there's only one coalition that can oppose Christian white nationalism. That's the Democratic Party. So would you say that that was the case, that the times right now require us to rally around the party, and that any other types of organization would be very weak?
So the question was, do I think that the Democratic Party is the only force that's able to fully combat white Christian nationalism? In answer to that question, I'll start with one thing. American Atheists is a 501c3. We do not engage in electoral work. I don't endorse or oppose candidates. But what I'll say is that no party is immune from these forces, that there is, that we have to think beyond just the political structures that exist. that there are cities in this country where there's not really a choice on partisan issues, right? That in the city of Philadelphia, we're not likely to elect a Republican majority to our city council or as mayor. And so it's not just pulling the lever or pulling a box for one political party. I think that if we could show folks that in the Republican Party as well, that white Christian nationalism is a losing proposition long-term, I would much rather fight about things like marginal tax rates or, the proper role of government or whatever, rather than, are these people here poisoning the blood of America? I would much rather be talking about actual policy issues. But I think we have to think beyond just partisan politics as well, that there are community organizing groups out there that do more than just that. Do I think that we should abstain from partisan politics? Absolutely not. I think we need to be in these political discussions with the parties and show and demonstrate to elected officials who are running for office, who are thinking about running for office, that folks who agree with us, that are in line with our values, are reliable voters that are going to turn out, that are going to show up, support them, so that they listen to us. The reason that white Christian nationalist groups have so much power is because they're an incredibly effective, mobilized group out there. That's why, that's one of the great things they did. They have some built-in advantages over our community, though. They have a place that they go every single week. They have leaders that they listen to for really important issues who can tell them, this is a fight for the soul of America. This is a fight for your soul. You're going to go to hell if you don't do this. And oh, by the way, give me 10% of your income. They can do that. We don't have those same structural advantages. But despite all of those disadvantages on our part, do you know which religious group is the most politically engaged in America? Atheists. Then agnostics. That's the truth, because we care about the here and now. We are a reliable group that's showing up and turning out to vote. Now, I'm not going to pretend for a moment to speak for all atheists. I'm not the Pope of atheism. I cannot excommunicate atheists for, not agreeing with me on political issues. I don't even have a nice fancy hat. I got none of that. But what I can tell you is that by and large, atheists and humanists agree more than 90% on issues like abortion, on issues like LGBT rights, on issues like public education. And so if you're a member of a community that is hesitant to speak out on so-called political issues, the example I often give is that if you survey atheist agnostics and you say, how many of you agree that abortion should be legal? The answer is about 90% say that abortion should be legal. If you ask that same group of people, how many of you believe in a God of some kind, not the God of the Bible, but some sort of higher life force, something like that, squishy sort of deistic God. Something like 25% say that they believe in that. So you have better agreement on abortion than you do on whether or not there's a God. And so if you're at all skeptical or hesitant about weighing in on this controversial issue, I can tell you, if your group's position is, well, God doesn't exist, you're alienating more people than you are if you come out in favor of abortion. So what I would say is, you don't have to do electoral politics to find coalitions and find people that agree with you to build that popular movement pushing back, but that politics is a necessary part of it. That politics is not some dirty word. You need to show up. And it's not just showing up to vote every 4 years or every 2 years, or for whatever reason in New Jersey every year because you guys do state elections at a weird time. We'll put that another time. It's showing up to city council meetings. It's showing up to school board meetings. It's attending civic groups. It's being a member of the League of Women Voters or the League of Conservation Voters or whatever civic group you want to be a part of, and showing the overlap in these values and how all of these things are interconnected and how we all need to be more involved. It's talking to your loved ones and your family about, gasp, religion and politics, right? Having those difficult conversations at Thanksgiving. And it's, going out there and being sort of the person to bear the brunt of that, to shoulder that burden sometimes. For the people who are too beaten down and tired and just drained from having to deal with it all the time, sometimes it falls on us guys, right? To be like, listen, abortion, important issue. We shouldn't have to rely, while we should elevate, obviously, the voice of women and people who are affected by abortion bans, we need to speak out too. We shouldn't rely on LGBTQ people to have to be the ones to speak out all the time on why LGBTQ issues matter. Shouldn't have to come down to atheists to talk about why church-state separation matters, right? Part of that is breaking down these barriers, building communities, building a movement, building coalition outside of politics, but finding those sort of third spaces, the places that you go to find community. So putting yourself out there a little bit and building that beyond just politics. So I hope that answered your question. It's probably a little bit more than you asked for, but I apologize. So I think you had a question, and then we'll go to Jeff.
You touched on it in your class, but I just wanted to, so what can we learn from them as far as being, because you said they're effective.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
They're minority, but they're effective. So what can we specifically learn?
Yeah. So the question is, what can we learn from them being Christian nationalist groups, I assume? Yeah. So, I mean, I think one of them is messaging, just being unapologetic about hammering a simple, straightforward message. Now, obviously, some of that you have to, some of the ways that they approach it are just by lying, right? Stirring up moral panics. We don't want to do that, right? What I said in my remarks, we don't want to fall into this sort of base populism of, there are these elites out there who are trying to take things away from you, and it's them that are the problem. Like, don't get me wrong. I firmly believe in the constitutional right, the human right to believe whatever you want to believe, practice your religion without interference from the government. I think they should have the right to preach hate in their churches. But what I don't think is that that should go uncontested, unopposed, and unchallenged. So what can we learn from them? Number one, don't just come at people with facts and figures. Come at people with stories. Don't talk about how 95% of abortions happen before the second trimester and a very small percentage happen in the third trimester. Rather, we need to talk about the reality on the ground right now in Texas and in Georgia, how people are bleeding out in hospitals, parking lots, until they're sick enough to allay the concerns of doctors that they're going to be charged with murder for performing an abortion on a non-viable pregnancy, on performing the medically necessary treatment to treat an ongoing miscarriage. And point out, I mean, this is one fact and figure, but point out that infant mortality has jumped in states with abortion bans. But tie that back to the people, the very real people who are experiencing the anguish of a wanted pregnancy and not being able to terminate it at an appropriate time, and instead having to carry it just about to term, and then possibly losing the ability to have a family, a wanted family in the future, because the treatment they received was substandard, was not what was medically indicated for them. Telling those stories about the very real effects of the laws these people are advocating, putting a human face on that, that's what we need to do. That's something that they learned to do very well. Look at, the Masterpiece Cake Shop case. Completely manufactured case. But oh, this poor baker, he just wants to bake cakes. His name is Jack. Or the coach in Washington. Coach Joe, he just wanted to pray. No, it's a made up case. You're lying, but there's this very sympathetic guy. He's just a poor football coach. How tear, right? They find sympathetic people and then build a case around that. Now, they lie, but we don't have to do that. We have the real people, real examples of things on our side. The only way that they are able to do this stuff is just by making it up. We have that disadvantage. We actually care about the truth, but we have to be better messengers. We can't, it's not enough to have a peer-reviewed study. It's not enough to have charts and flip charts and graphs and whatnot. We have to have testimonial story from individuals, from people who are harmed by these laws or who would be harmed by the things they're proposing. I think that's probably lesson number one, is just be right smack down on messaging and do a better job marketing. So
So would you want to get together and get you a fancy hat?
no, it's fine. The question was, do I want a fancy hat? The answer is no. I'm good.
Can I comment on?
Yeah, comment away.
I think one thing we need to do better. Right. Set aside what's important differences between different groups.
Yep.
Like this fight that we're in is going to take partnering with, the NAACP, which is going to have a lot of very religious members. That we're going to have some fundamental disagreements on that question.
Yep.
But we need to learn to set those things aside. The Christian right is not in fact one monolithic thing.
Right.
All of these different churches have conflicts and believe different things about these minor ones. And they learned pretty fast that they need to set that aside to maintain common. And we're gonna have to do the same thing to oppose them.
Yeah. And I'll point out that, so what Jeff was saying is we have to set aside the less important stuff. This was Jeff, who's our litigation counsel at American Atheists, who's here with us. He said we need to set aside some of the differences, and that's one thing that the religious right did, and that they're not a monolith, and they set aside some of the less important fights. I'll point out some of those fights are not less important, right? They're like central to the differences between these religious groups, right? But they said, oh, you know, what's really important right now is seizing and finding political power so that we can do these 2 or 3 things that we do agree on. And we're just going to ignore the rest of the stuff. It's not that we're setting aside or dropping our belief in whatever, you know, different parts of dogma or doctrine. It's that in this one arena, we're going to focus on these 2 or 3 things, and find things that where there is common ground. Now, part of the challenge is identifying, okay, what are the red lines for us? What can we set aside? Should we, for example, find common cause with someone who agrees with, or with an organization that explicitly endorses, you know, really retrograde, reactionary, anti-immigrant policies if it means protecting abortion? Or about another example, a group that supports what we might call like population control, of like, oh, we should just, you know, like, because that's another group that does exist out there, and they have this sort of science, quasi-scientific approach of like, well, it's simply the case that there are good genes and bad genes, and it's very much like, oh, you're doing some eugenics right now, aren't you? Ugh, okay, like I don't. That's a red line still. Like we can't set aside some of the stuff. We shouldn't like full-throatedly embrace these groups if they're in. We have to lay out some very specific values, and not, excuse the phrase, sell our soul in order to just achieve a political win. But it's constantly a negotiation of what are these values that are red lines, non-negotiables. American Atheists organizationally we have a list of values that we adhere to. And we think very deeply about who we're going to engage in policy work with if it means that, oh, we disagree really strongly on a few of these. But the theological debates, you know, do they believe in God? Are they Christian? Are they whatever religious belief? As long as they're framing and thinking about issues in a way that it's accessible to all people, not just saying, well, God told us to do it, so we have to do it. We're willing to like have that conversation. And I think that's at least a starting point for how to think about this. But not just sort of out of hand rule out any religious group, because you never know where you can find common cause. So we'll go here in a minute.
Fortunately, our values are fairly well correlated. And while it's not a totally hypothetical argument or concern or worry about who we align with, the number of potential allies that are unacceptable for one of those groups are relatively small.
Yeah.
Or the groups are very relatively small.
Yeah.
And so 90% of the people who we will encounter are going to be acceptable on the grounds that you're
Sure. But and one thing that I know a lot of folks have struggled with is, you know, not wanting to wade into politics, quote unquote, because they don't want to turn away anyone, right? You know, that you have like, oh my gosh, we only have 50 members of our group. If we lose one person because that person is a jerk, you know, or they, you know, like that's a very real one where, oh, we don't want to say anything to that person, even though he's making a bunch of people uncomfortable. Well, what you're doing is creating an environment where other people can't come in, and you're not living up to your own values. Or, oh, we don't want to alienate this person because they're really, really, really opposed to abortion, and we don't want to come out in favor of abortion. Well, what you're doing is sort of holding everybody hostage to that one person, and you're living sort of from a model of scarcity. Like, oh, we only have 50 people. How can we possibly replace 5% of our group if they leave? Well, you're asking the wrong question. How many people are not joining your group in the first place because you didn't come out forcefully in favor of something or in opposition to something, because you didn't show up to a protest, because you're silent on whatever issue it might be? And so I'm not saying you need to get involved as a group, like the New Jersey Humanist Network or whatever organization doesn't need to have a position on every single policy issue, but you should be willing to have discussion, discourse, and you yourself go like, oh, I really care about transit, and they want to add a bike lane, or they want to add a bus stop, and I really support that. And hey, I'm going to go to this meeting, and if anybody wants to go, come with me, and we'll do this. Great. It doesn't mean that your group is supporting it. And then when you go, you say, hi, I'm Nick from the New Jersey Humanist Network, and I wanted to talk about why this bus stop at the library will be great, because it'll help people come to the library. It'll ensure that people that don't have access to a car can access voting, can access the internet here, can get books, can come to community spaces, all of that. And I think that's great. And then you have somebody who comes up to you after the meeting and says, what was the group you said you're from? Oh, I've never heard of that. And then they come to this meeting, right? That's how we build power long-term. And it's hard and it takes a long time. There's no magic bullet. There's no one thing you can do, but it's part of that, I guess, tapestry of things to do. So we'll go here, and then I think we got maybe a last question.
So I'm thinking.
No, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, then.
So I'm thinking I have a comment, I have a question.
Sure.
One was from the first video about the French and Indian War. It's funny, they were talking about Catholics as the enemy.
Yeah.
So it was the terrible enemy that they had. So that leads into actually thinking about Leonard Leo, because I did hear some of the episodes of the show, and I didn't realize he was Catholic. So I guess the real answer is probably they're okay with him, but are they really okay with him as a Catholic? The nationalists?
Yeah. So the question was about Leonard Leo, and like he's Catholic. He's very Catholic. So there's this uneasy alliance because of the politics, that it's sort of a self-fulfilling. Yeah, the 1.6 billion certainly helps sort of paper over any differences, right? He's the guy who picks up the tab every time you go out to dinner, and he's a little annoying, but you deal with it, right? So yeah, do they view him as part of the club? The answer is yes, because remember, white Christian nationalism is not purely evangelical in nature. It's not even necessarily like white, like that's a moving target, right? Like in the 1800s, white didn't include the Irish, right? Didn't include Italians, right? So, but it's a question about like, who is truly American and who's part of this like club. And often like people have to get elbowed out of the club in order to be like, to make room, I guess, for this next group who's coming in. And so it's not a religious thing. It's not a theological distinction. It's entirely a political movement that has religious language, religious overtones, religious elements to it, but it has very little to do with the actual theology. They don't care about, oh, are you a Trinitarian or a Unitarian? Are you like, doesn't matter. All you care about is that Christians have this sort of dominant position. But I will say there's this ascendant movement within conservative Catholicism that like Catholic integralism would be the word. I'm going to like use a bunch of vocab here. There will be a test. That these are like out and out theocrats who think that government should be subservient, not just to, the abstractness of the Bible, but to the Catholic Church, to the Pope. And, they're very pissed off at this Pope because this Pope's a socialist. Oh my gosh. Right. And, these are the people who often don't like, they believe that, the Vatican, that the papacy has been vacant since Vatican II, right? Like we're talking about some really extreme people here. But they've made this alliance because and a lot of them are young, like these are a lot of like young men. And again, just a reminder that it's not just like racial and religious hierarchies, it's often gender hierarchies that are sort of enforced as part of this ideology. And there's this appeal to these lonely young white dudes, largely white, not always, who are really taken in by the idea that they should be like assigned a wife. And, they're totally on board with that. They're not big on consent. And so it's really scary stuff. And these are people that have huge followings online. If you are somebody who uses TikTok, I don't, but if you are on TikTok, there's like this whole cadre of like Theo bros or trad wives, right? Like this whole movement of people that are like, oh, actually, yeah, being, not having any rights, like women who will say not having any rights, allowing my husband to make up decisions about who I'm going to vote for, totally fine. William Wolf, the guy whose video we showed, fully on board with the idea that, women should probably just listen to their wives about who to vote for. I mean, JD Vance, like this guy sort of sticks his foot in his mouth on gender roles and roles in the marriage, where he said, asked if his wife converted to Catholicism like he did. And he said, oh, no. And, but she still comes to church and that's great. And, she's a trooper for it because she's got 3 kids and she has to watch them while I go to church. And it's like, she has 3 kids. It's been a while since I took biology, and I know you're trying to get sex ed out of schools, but I think that's a 2-person thing, you know? So like they're really all in on enforcing those gender norms, which, you know, are sort of a defining characteristic of really conservative Catholic doctrine and theology, which, by the way, is out of step with the overwhelming majority of Catholics. The American Catholics, as on average, are like right in the center of American politics, like once you average everything out. But there are these ultra conservative weirdo Catholics that are really out of step with the rest of Catholics, and, you know, are well represented among the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and the leadership of the Catholic Church, because it's, you know, a certain sort of hierarchical organization. And that appeals to white Christian nationalism, that like top-down hierarchical structure where we can kick you out if we think you're bad. That appeals to Christian nationalism. So they're kind of like the like academic heft behind the Christian nationalist movement. Why are the Christian nationalists on the Supreme Court all Catholic? Right? You know, there's something to say there. So yeah, please.
That's the reason for Leonard Leo. Want them to-
Well, yes. A lot of private jet flights and vacations and things. It must be nice, right? Yeah. Lisa?
Thank you to folks on Zoom, that if you have a question, please get it into the chat now.
If you have a question, get it into the chat now, Zoom.
Wrapping up.
Oh.
That's me, that's me.
And
Don't make
then-
it easy for Lisa.
So two questions. One is really quick. So that weird guy said,
You need to narrow it down.
transcription, that guy said globo homo nationalism.
Yeah.
What
yeah.
the heck is that?
So he thinks that, so his view is that LGBTQ people have like taken over all these structures globally. It's like the globalist thing where it's like, oh, they're talking simultaneously about Jews, LGBT people, and that's basically it, Jews and LGBT people, as like controlling all of the like global everything. So it's sort of a like quasi lizard person type conspiracy theory, that they genuinely believe that LGBT people have taken over these social structures and governments and are silencing and crushing under the heel of government, you know, those who would oppose them. And, you know, if you look around in the United States, that's just hilariously inaccurate. You know, we handhold and, you know, walk walk on eggshells around anti-LGBT Christians and religious folks all the time. And, you know, all that happen from a government perspective, what they're not used to is receiving any amount of like social pushback. They're very upset that they're not popular. And so they sort of like, they have all this government power, but they're very angry that they don't have the same level of like cultural power that they once used to. And I'm not saying they're powerless, but when they look to like pop culture, you know, and they try to like replicate pop culture that is, you know, pretty pluralistic, pretty inclusive of LGBT people, of different races, of different religions. And they try to like replicate that of like, well, I'm not seeing myself. I am a victim here. And then it's really terrible, right? They review bomb stuff that dares to have a woman as lead character, or, you know, threaten boycotts because an LGBT person was one of hundreds of other brand partners for Budweiser, just to pick a random example. They think that there's this conspiracy going on to silence anti-LGBT voices because they want to say out loud that all LGBT people are, their belief that all LGBT people are sexual predators who are trying to prey on children. They want to just be able to say that. And just like they can't say racial slurs out loud as often anymore, they can't say that out loud anymore. And they're very angry about that. And they think that it's like government censorship that's preventing it, when in fact it's just 90%, 80% of people don't suck anymore on these issues and are slightly better. Not perfect, but slightly better, and are holding them socially accountable. And, you know, that's how this works. That's how a society works over time. And they're very upset about that. And that's what he means by it, is that, you know, yeah, it's just insane though. It's very weird. Yeah.
For this later. Given what day it is.
Yeah. How should everyone vote now?
American Atheists making, or whatever the election result.
Yeah. we were having this conversation in the drive up. It's like, okay, we need to draft basically 4 different memos of what's going to happen and then throw away 3 of them, which is sort of the never-ending task of people working in advocacy, people working in the nonprofit world around election time, is you draft up a bunch of plans and throw away 80% of them because, you know, you have to plan for every contingency. What I'll say is that folks should go onto our website, future.atheists.org, for our strategic plan that includes the areas of work that we're going to engage in, the sort of 5, I don't want to say 5 pillars because that's Islam, but the 5 core areas of programming that we're going to work on. And you can learn about exactly what that means. And we developed this plan specifically to be resilient no matter what happens in November. Technically, that's still true because it's October. So no matter what happens in a week and a half, we will have a plan, and we're working on exactly what the specifics are. We're going to continue investing in grassroots groups, just to give you some specifics. We're going to continue working at the state level, because no matter who's president, no matter who controls Congress, state work is going to still be there. There are going to be states where we can advance equality, where we can do great things. We just did it in Colorado, passing a law that requires every hospital and medical provider in the state to disclose upfront and ahead of time to patients what procedures they will and will not perform on this list of a whole host of things. And that helps people make a decision about, well, do I really want to go to this hospital? It also enables the state to collect all this data. So they know, oh, wait a second, if we allow through our regulatory agencies this hospital merger to happen, what's going to end up happening is that no one in 200-mile radius is going to have access to abortion care. Maybe we shouldn't let this merger go through, right? That's the power of these little changes that, you know, I'm not going to pretend that this is some like huge earth-shattering thing, but for a patient who is trying to get medical care, you're damn right it is. Knowing whether or not you're going to be able to get the care you need, that's a potentially life-saving difference when you can plan ahead. Now, do we have more work to do? Absolutely. Is it a scandal, or should it be a scandal in America that somewhere between 1 in 6 and 1 in 4 hospital beds are affiliated with a religious organization that won't provide you with a full range of care? Absolutely. How do we address that? We're working on it. But this is one step in the right direction. You know, we're working on a bill that has passed the legislature twice in New York and been vetoed by the governor twice, ensuring that people who are interacting with the criminal legal system are informed of their right to not be subjected to a religiously based substance use treatment program. That's it. To tell them you have this right. And the governor has vetoed it twice because she says, well, it's already guaranteed. If it was already guaranteed, we wouldn't have to sue over it a bunch. And people wouldn't have to go through this process of like being sentenced and then finding out while they're in prison that their rights are being taken away, and then go through the rigmarole of that. We wouldn't have had to sue and win a victory at district court where the judge basically said, this is hilariously unconstitutional. You win on everything before we even go to trial. Eliminate this requirement from the guy's record right now. And then, golly, wouldn't you know, once that requirement was lifted, the guy we were representing got out of jail, got out of prison after being denied parole multiple times, or probation, parole. He was in prison for more than a year extra because the state refused to do what is already his right. And the only reason that his rights were protected is because he knew to come to us after trying it himself first. Yep.
He could have been out a year.
Yep. If he had just sat there and read back, yes, we agnostics are doomed to a life of alcoholism, he would have been able to get out of prison almost a year and a half before he did. And the judge said that cannot be allowed to continue. This is already the law of the land. It's been the law of the land for decades. But for whatever reason, the governor of New York, the Democratic governor of New York, so when we talk about, you know, which party, we need to say, listen, this is why this is important. It's not just, you know, picking a side and being like apologists for them. It's holding them accountable as well. So we're going to keep doing that. We've got more kind of in the pipeline that we're working on. We're going to keep doing that. Check out future.atheist.org, read through what's there. We've got our values, we've got our mission, and we've got our plan. And plan, general outline, more specifics, depending on what happens in 9 days. So yeah, and if you want more about what we're doing, atheists.org is the website. You can follow us on Instagram, American Atheists, or on Blue Sky, at atheists.org. So find us all there. All right. Well, I didn't see any other questions in the chat. So thank you, everyone. Glad to be here.